All right, today I wanted to look at the sovereignty of God in circumstances. And trust me, there is a lot of people out there that can teach this a lot better than I can. And it it we could go on for hours talking about the sovereignty of God, and I'm going to try to condense this the best I can to keep it in line with the same time frame of the other videos that I've done. But we understand from scripture that God is sovereign in all things. And when we look at Romans chapter 8, verse 28, the famous verse that everybody knows, and we know that God causes all things to work together for good to those who love God, to those who are called according to his purpose. So I want to look at something to kind of help you see the sovereignty of God. And if we look at Isaiah chapter 10, we see that we are talking about Assyria here, and God is using Assyria to humble Israel for their sins and to turn their hearts back to him for his purposes of correcting them. But we read in verse 5, it says, "Woe to Assyria, the rod of my anger, and the staff in whose hands is my indignation. I send it against a godless nation, and command it against the people of my fury to capture spoil and to seize plunder, and to trample them down like mud in the streets." So we see that God is sending Assyria, and he calls them the rod of his anger and his indignation. But notice how he says, "Woe to Assyria." And we get to that in verse 7 when it says, "But it does not intend to act in this way, and it does not think in its heart in this way. Rather, what is in its heart is to destroy and to cut off many nations." So we see that God is using Assyria to humble Israel through his power, but Assyria is not they don't they're not aware of what God's plans are. They are acting out with their own sinful intentions against Israel, but God is using them to humble Israel. And it says he says in verse 12, "So it will be that when the Lord has completed all his work on Mount Zion and on Jerusalem, he will say, I will punish the fruit of the arrogant heart of the king of Assyria and the pomp of his eyes, which are raised high. For he has said, by the power of my hand and by my wisdom I did this, for I have understanding, and I removed the boundaries of the peoples and plundered their treasures. And like a mighty man, I brought down their inhabitants. And my hand reached for the wealth of the peoples like a nest. And as one gathers abandoned eggs, I gathered all the earth, and there was not one that flapped its wing, or opened its beak, or chirped." So you see, the king of Assyria, he is boasting in himself. He's bragging. He's saying, "I did this. He's feeling himself right here, and he is arrogantly bragging as if this was not God's plan, as if he did this through his own power. And we know that God controls all things. And when we look at verse 15, it says, "Is the axe to boast itself over the one who chops with it? Is the saw to magnify itself over the one who wields it? That would be like a rod wielding those who lift it, or like a staff lifting him who is not wood." So we see that Assyria was just an instrument in God's hands, and it would be foolish for the axe to boast over the one who's using the axe. So we see that God is sovereign in all things, but man is still responsible for his own sin. And I know that that's hard for our fallen minds to understand, but it is harmonized perfectly in God's mind and in heaven. And one day we will understand that as well. And another thing that we can look at with this is Genesis chapter 50. So we know that Joseph was sent to Egypt to preserve life during the famine. God orchestrated all of those things to happen so that he could preserve life. And he says to his brothers, when they were basically asking him, they were worried that he was going to try to take retaliation against them for selling them into slavery. And Joseph says, "Now do not be grieved or angry with yourselves because you sold me here, for God sent me before you to preserve life. For the famine has been in the land these 2 years, and there are still 5 years in which there will be neither plowing nor harvesting. God sent me before you to preserve for you a remnant in the earth, and to keep you alive by a great deliverance." So all of those things that happened to Joseph, him being sold into slavery, you remember his brothers were going to kill him. And then there were some people passing by, which of course, was according to God's plan. He was sending those people at the perfect timing. You see, God works all these things together. And he was sold into slavery. He was elevated to a position of power, and he basically oversaw all of Egypt. And God had sent him there for his purposes to preserve Israel. But we still look at man's responsibility. In Genesis 50, verse 20, Joseph tells his brothers, he says, "As for you, you meant evil against me, but God meant it for good in order to bring about this present result, to preserve many people alive." See, God controls all things, and he is completely sovereign, and his purposes will stand. That's why it's so encouraging when we look at Romans chapter 8. As Christians, we can have total confidence. And Romans 8 says, "And we know that God causes all things to work together for good to those who love God, to those who are called according to his purpose." I mean, when you let that verse really sink in, and when you understand when it says all things, it means all things. And it's so encouraging to us, and just let that sink in for the day.